Hello and welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future, where we talk to changemakers in climate and sustainability. I'm your host, Felicia Jackson, and today we're looking into one of the most contentious responses for driving action on climate change, the carbon markets. So what exactly are carbon markets and why should business care? Well, on one level, carbon markets are financial markets designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by assigning a price to carbon, allowing companies and governments to trade emissions allowances and credits in the hope of reducing emissions in a cost-effective way. We know that integrity and transparency and clarity about what credits actually represent are key to the market's effectiveness, both for the mandatory and the voluntary markets. But in simple terms, they're a system designed to reduce emissions by putting a price on carbon. The idea is that by doing that, we can actually incentivize the reduction of emissions. Now, that presents both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, it introduces a new cost center. Companies have now got to factor in the price of carbon when making decisions about operations and supply chains and investments. It also means they have to spend a lot of money on understanding where their emissions are, how to manage them, and how to report on them. But at the same time, they create opportunities for innovation and efficiency. So whether that's reduced emissions from energy efficiency or through the use of renewable energy. At the same time, if you can reduce your emissions below an allotted allowance within a compliance market, then you can sell the excess as credits. And that actually means you could even turn your carbon or sustainability strategy into a new revenue stream. It's about avoided losses. If you actually manage your emissions in an effective way, it means you're not at risk of fines for breaching barriers. But it's also about competitive edge. As more and more regions implement carbon pricing mechanisms, it's necessary to stay ahead of the curve by investing in low carbon technology and practices. It's about reputation and intangible value, and it's about playing your part in showing a commitment to fighting climate change. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by Pablo Fernandez, Chief Executive of carbon market specialists EcoSecurities. He's been in this world for a long time, and he's going to help us have a conversation about the carbon markets and why they matter in today's carbon-conscious world. Welcome, Pablo. Could you introduce yourself and EcoSecurities and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Thank you very much, Felicia, for the opportunity to be here and for allowing us to share a bit of our knowledge and experience on this not so new market. So starting with the company itself, so EcoSecurities, the company was created on early '97. It was created on the back of some of its founders worked on a series of carbon transactions on the early '90s and aiming to replicate and accelerate this capital mobilization towards climate-friendly projects. At that point of time, reforestation. To give you an indication on how old we are on this market, we are even older than Kyoto Protocol itself. The Kyoto Protocol only came by December '97, which was our first experience on how volatile carbon markets can be. The company was created for the development of forestry projects, and then the Kyoto Protocol came and they left forest out, and we had to adjust ourselves and look for new area sectors to work with carbon. So EcoSecurities we are today a global company focused on the global south and working on supporting investors, governments, and infrastructure developers on how to account for the carbon markets on their operations and how we can and accelerating the capital mobilization towards mitigation activities across the globe and using the carbon market as the instrument. And actually, I joined this journey with EcoSecurities 22 years ago now. So I joined the Brazilian office in 2003. At that point of time, people used to call me crazy guy who works with carbon markets. That what does it mean? How can you price the reduction of something and not the production and so on? But yeah, 22 years later, almost here I am. still trying to explain to people what it means, what it's designed for, what its actual goals, and how important it is for not only for our present, but especially for the development of our future.
Now, I think that's a really important point, because you mentioned the fact that when you started, you were the crazy guy. We've all been there. But the carbon markets are a conversation that have become mainstream without perhaps an associated level of knowledge and expertise of the history and what they were set up for and what they're intended to achieve. So I think, one of the most important questions there is in terms of the carbon markets and the role they play in addressing climate change is how effective they are in reducing emissions. And I suppose in many ways, is that what they're intended for? What are the carbon markets intended to do?
That's a good question. So look, carbon markets, they are basically an economic instrument. So it's one economic instrument that is used to direct the economical development of the society. So the way it happens is for every action that we as human beings we take, there are parts of these actions that will be priced in, and there are parts of consequences of our actions that may not be priced in, and that's what we call externality. So, for example, when you buy your liter of gasoline, it is priced in all the energy content of that gasoline and the practicality and the energy density and all that. But the burning of that gasoline emits a series of pollutants. CO2 is one of them, but you have volatiles, you have particulates and all that. That generates damages to other human beings, but also to the nature. And for us to remediate that damage, there's a cost, but no one pays for that cost, right? So the idea is that, okay, let's then put a cost on all these damages. And if you cannot avoid that damage, okay, that cost will be charged to you, and it will be used for remediating the problem. Or you embed that cost on your actions, and you may decide to change your own course of action. So I will no more use gasoline. I will use another fuel or an electric car. So that is the concept of pricing and externality, right? And for many, many years, carbon has been an externality. Hundreds of years ago, people were not aware that the carbon emissions could generate such a global effect. And on more recent decades, it became clear what carbon emissions on the atmosphere could cause, and the fact that it was a global problem and it would require a global solution. So a lot of economists since the 70s, they have been thinking about, okay, how can we then mobilize society on that? And if it is a global problem, probably it's an expensive problem. So two things that they started to take into consideration was how we mobilize all and everyone, and how we, if it's expensive, how we try to be as efficient as possible, because it will be a cost that the entire society will pay. It's not only one part of the market or of the society paying and the other not paying, right? Literally everyone will need to pay. So I think that this element of trying to define effectiveness is important, right? So a carbon market, the carbon market has been created with one of the ultimate goals of optimizing the allocation of capital and ensuring that we minimize the social cost of reducing our emissions. And then, well, you start with the question, okay, so we need to put a price on an emission. How do we do that? And you do have mainly two ways of doing that: the carbon tax and the cap and trade system. On a very simplistic way, my simplest way to let people understand the distinction between the two, and also using the economic languages and principles, right? A carbon tax, you define the price of the carbon, $5, $10, $20, but you don't put a cap. You don't know how much you're going to emit at the end of the year or at the end of the decade. And along the time, you try to adjust the tax to ensure that you are effective and you are indeed driving reduction of emissions on your area of influence. A cap and trade system is actually the opposite. You put a cap, but you don't define the price, and you let the market define what is the cost of abatement of an emission reduction, right? And then this discovery of the cost of abatement of emission reduction is actually the carbon market. So is when you create the ability between players in a society and in the market to interact with each other and find their way the optimal way of reducing their emissions. And the pricing is the signal of, okay, what is the marginal abatement cost of my next ton to be reduced, right? So I think that is an important thing, because the carbon markets, they are not designed to reduce their emissions. What reduces the emissions are the regulations, right? The cap that, for example, a regulator puts in, and the carbon market then will indicate to you what is the cost of such an ambition defined by a regulator. So when people say, prices are close to zero, the carbon market is a failure. Well, not the carbon market, but the definition of what is our goal. Our goal was a failure, was a so low goal that we quickly achieved that. And to keep that goal, it costs us nothing, right? So that is what a carbon pricing of zero means. Now, on the other hand, you can also say that a carbon price of 1,000 or 1,000,000 may be also a failure, because then becomes too expensive. And if it's too expensive, you are not necessarily achieving your goal of being optimal on your investment allocation, on being efficient and effective on reducing your emissions.
So that makes a great deal of sense, because effectively we're talking about something that has never really been integrated into the cost benefit analysis of business decision making or investment decision making. So we're talking about, in a sense, a sort of evolution of our understanding of how things work. So it's about responsibility and accountability for these costs that have never been internalized. And the carbon markets are a tool for effective pricing of action. That's fascinating, because then what that says to me is the discussion, which has become very political, is very much a policy decision. And you mentioned, when you talked about the launch of EcoSecurities, the volatility driven in the markets by the fact that the original climate treaty, the Kyoto Protocol, didn't actually involve forests in its credit mechanisms. So could you talk me through what really happens within the climate treaties? I realize, obviously, that there's lots of things that go on far beyond carbon pricing, but I'm thinking about the use of carbon markets, because, we know that carbon pricing through tax can be very, very effective, but obviously extra taxes are politically very difficult. So, what is the difference between the compliance markets under these climate treaties and the voluntary markets, which we know people are using today, even though we're sort of past the end of the Kyoto carbon markets and we haven't really started, well, we're just beginning to start on Article 6 under Paris. So what's going on?
When we talk about climate agenda, many of us link directly climate to carbon market. You go to a COP and you realize the carbon market is one topic among other dozens of topics that are related to climate agenda. So loss and damage, adaptation, finance mobilization, and then finance linked somehow with carbon market, right? So, and then usually the negotiation outcome is a balance of all these topics together. So there will be COPs that will have greater success on the loss and damage agenda, but then eventually limited development on the carbon market side, or we'll have great developments on adaptation and so on. So I think the Kyoto Protocol, we were simply unlucky of actually having to give up on the forestry part in order to enable to get a broader negotiation and move faster with the climate negotiations. But that is a great indication of what the carbon market is. So it is a regulation-driven market, right? If there is no regulation, there is a certain limitation of what would be the demand for that market. So you do have what we call compliance markets that are usually linked to existence of regulations that will then drive the demand of emission reductions, and you have the voluntary market, as you said. I actually like to divide it today into 3 segments. It's what I call the compliance market, the voluntary market, and the quasi-compliance or quasi-voluntary market. Depends on on if you want to see the glass half full or half empty. So the compliance market is, you do have a regulator, can be the United Nations, can be one national government, and that regulator will impose limits of emissions or will impose a pricing of carbon. So what I was saying is that the climate agenda on these annual international negotiations, they are quite complex. So they involve many topics. It's not only about carbon markets or carbon pricing. You do have loss and damage, you do have adaptation, you do have sustainable development, you have technology transfer. So I have so many topics that quite often one topic may need to give up on some areas in order to enable a broader achievement.
Can I interrupt and just ask it, because I think this is again one thing that I think people don't really understand, that the negotiations that happen every year within the climate change sphere, they're incredibly complicated. There's not a lot of time, and they are a negotiation. Because I often get, especially from the younger generation, who are very much like, I don't understand why this hasn't changed, why we haven't achieved this, why we're not taking action. You know, it is a negotiation from countries that have been doing this for a really long time. I mean, do you think it's an effective way of dealing with the problem?
Well, it is a negotiation with over 200 parties that try to negotiate by consensus. So it's really hard to achieve the consensus, right? And while I do hear a lot of criticism on this international negotiation process, I haven't been presented anything better and more democratic and participative than that.
Because I do remember hearing about, was it the Copenhagen COP, where a small group of countries got together and came up with an agreement, but I think it was only 9 countries that were involved in the conversation. So while there may be challenges with a long negotiation with 200 parties, at least there's legitimacy in involving all the voices that need to take part.
It's interesting that you're bringing this specific event, because I think Copenhagen was one of the greatest failures and one of the greatest problems that we had on these climate negotiation processes. So there was a deadline that supposedly 2009 was the year that we should come with a replacement scheme to the Kyoto Protocol that would expire in 2012. You did have the host country really trying to push forward an agenda. And then as a trial to accelerate the process and accelerate the agreement, a small group of players went into a small room, drafted a text. And when that came out, the other almost 190 parties said, I don't know, I don't recognize. Actually, I don't trust you anymore to coordinate this negotiation process. And then you had this event of Obama, a lot of presidents and state chiefs going to COP, supposedly to sign a very important agreement, but actually going there for nothing, right? And that lack of trust on all the process cost many other COPs to come back to an area of trust and come back to a situation where they could agree on something. And actually, I personally like to link that event to the Paris Agreement, because until then, all the UN negotiation process was kind of a top-down. So they would agree what would happen to the world, and then from top to bottom, they would say, now you countries, that's what you have to do. And it was, as I said, a top-down imposement, right? Paris Agreement, no. Paris Agreement, they said, okay, we are really struggling on reaching an agreement. I'm really struggling on finding a common ground on how I can impose something to anyone. So we're going to flip. And Cristiano Figueiredo was really smart on flipping that. They said, okay, it will be a bottom-up. So each country will say what will be their intended contribution to climate mitigation. And I will not enforce anything. And perhaps they enforced too little things, because it's almost 10 years out now since the Paris Agreement, and we still don't have a standardization on how to do the NDC, how to report emissions, etc. So in one hand, Paris Agreement was a breakthrough. Again, for the first time, rather than being top-down, was bottom-up. And was great because we managed to, 6 years later, unlock the climate negotiations and move forward. But we are still paying the cost of this eventually lack of trust and this excessive relaxation of a structure, right? So we are still working on this element on on the NDCs of the countries. But again, we managed to get back on track.
See, it's utterly fascinating for those who are outside the negotiations, because you do have all these expectations of what needs to happen, what should happen. And I think that sort of brings me this flipping of responsibility from top down to bottom up brings me to this question of what should carbon credits be doing? There's obviously a key issue, which is avoid the emission of carbon, remove carbon from the atmosphere, whether that's technologically or biologically. You know, obviously with the gap between what's happened between Kyoto and Paris, there are challenges around the compliance markets and the voluntary markets. But why are there scandals in the voluntary carbon markets? What are the real problems that we have? And are they the same in both the compliance and the voluntary markets about how we measure and verify reductions? Or removals, in fact.
One of the questions you kind of skipped, because you were talking about what is the difference between the different types of markets. I started to answer on the previous round, but then you brought the Copenhagen, you brought these other interesting topics, and we did
Yeah, it happens. I did say I do go off on tangents because you just made me think of it, and I was like, oh.
But you just touched a point that I really like, and that's why I was very enthusiastically going there and answering that, and talking about the Copenhagen. For example, I was there in Copenhagen and was impressive. It was the first Super COP, right? The first time that they had like 40, 50,000 people, etc. People were expecting to be a historical moment. I was not supposed to go to that COP, but I did an extra effort to go at my personal level to try to be part of that. But yeah, then it was what it was. But anyway.
So what is the difference between the compliance and the voluntary markets?
So we were talking about the regulators and talking about parties agreeing on something and that becoming kind of a law or a regulation to be imposed on market participants. That is the definition of compliance market. You do have different instruments, as we also mentioned before. So the ETS or the carbon tax, but that is the definition of compliance market. The voluntary market, that covers all initiatives by individuals or companies who, without any sort of regulation or any imposement from one regulator, decides to take to embrace the climate agenda and then to have a plan of reducing such emissions and then using existing market mechanisms for achieving such goal. But I actually like to divide the market in three, because the way that we see today, you do have the compliance, as I said, where a regulator will monitor your emissions and will price your emissions or ask you to reduce that. The voluntary, you have literally no one doing that. At the best, some associations such as CDP or SBTi, that will provide you some guidance on how to measure, report, and pledge your emission reduction curves. But I see today a third market, which, depending on if you see the glass half full or half empty, you can call it semi-compliance or semi-voluntary. And this is very recent. So since a couple of years ago, a lot of the financial regulators, they decided to request companies, the listed companies at least, to report their climate risk, which usually is your climate emissions and what are your emission reduction pledges, right? But they are financial regulators. They are not monitoring, measuring your emissions. They are just giving you guidance on how you should report, what you should report, and what you should pledge. And it's up to you, closer to the voluntary side, on what will be your level of ambition on your pledge, what will be your level of ambition on your measurement, on your reporting, etc. And as part of any other financial report, like on a yearly basis, listed companies, they report their business plan, but they can change their business plan, right? The same thing happens on climate. So they report their climate emissions and climate pledges and emission reductions, etc., but they can change with the time. So that's why I call it semi-compliance or semi-voluntary, because you do have a regulator that doesn't regulate your emissions precisely. You have your voluntary level of ambition on your pledge. You can change it, but it's more difficult to change than a full voluntary pledge as we have on the voluntary markets. But what these three market segments have in common is the fact that you do have on a one way or another, the pricing of the carbon and the usage of market instruments for complying with such pledges, being an imposed or voluntary pledge. Okay, and that level of enforcement impacts price, right? A compliance market, you have a firm demand. It cannot change. So the cap is there. We know how much is our historical emissions, and we know how much we need to reduce our emissions in order to reach the cap. Or the price or the carbon tax is there. We know what is the price, and we know what we have to do to avoid paying that tax. On the voluntary side, the demand may be very fluid. Because people may say, well, I'm pledging to have that emission reduction. But if they find that the emission reduction is too expensive, they may change their pledge. And we have seen a lot that recently. So on a good day, we're going to see people doing a lot of pledges. On a bad day, halting pledges. So, and that's why also I have this third market, right? The semi-voluntary. Because they can hold their pledges, but they cannot do it from night to day or day to night. They will need to come with a new plan, present to the board, have the board approval, and then eventually change the. But for example, it is a sort of board approval, right? Not a regulator revision of the law or the regulatory framework.
But it's a really interesting halfway house between the two, because it's not being pushed by government imposition or sort of international pressure. It's more being pushed by domestic regulators concerned about risks that aren't being included.
Exactly.
Really, really interesting way of looking at it.
And as I said, the key difference is that this regulator is not monitoring your emissions, right? And most likely any punishment that you would have is because you didn't comply with your disclosure requirements or whatsoever.
So what really interests me about that is then that becomes, as you say, simply about disclosure, and it's up to surrounding stakeholders to have a response to that disclosure one way or another. But so it keeps in play that concept of choice, the thing that has become so politicized, this idea of imposition from, a government body. But so that when it comes to disclosure, that is sort of that's what's driving pressure and interest. But then it comes back to this issue of trust, this issue of what can we believe about the strategies these companies are using, these plans that they're putting in place. And that comes back to this idea of the trust in credits themselves, what they actually are and what they're intended to do. You mentioned this idea of capital allocation. So it's an incredibly useful way to get funding from the global north, perhaps to the global south. But so how do we know what makes a good credit?
So let me touch on two topics. First, what you just said. So usually compliance markets today, as they are today, they are national markets. So you do have the Paris Agreement as the framework for international cooperation, but due to a series of reasons and struggles on further international cooperation, what happened was a lot of the countries decided to move on themselves. So you do have the EU ETS, which is a continental market, not a national market only. But you have the Chinese market, you have the Korean market, you have the Singaporean carbon tax, the Colombian carbon tax, the Mexican carbon tax, the Chilean and South African carbon tax. So you, according to the latest report from the World Bank, you have over 80 carbon pricing schemes under development or under execution across the world. And then the result of that is that you have 80 carbon prices because most of these schemes, they are not interconnected. So they will kind of give you an idea of what is the abatement cost on that market. So Europe, recently the prices they have fluctuated between 60 and up to 100 euros. So it's an indication of what is the carbon abatement cost at Europe, given the cap that Europe imposed. You go to US. So California market has prices on the range of 20 to 45, 50. So you go to Korea, the prices now, they were at 35 at some point, but now they are on the range of 5, which means that to reach that ambition, it costs almost nothing for the Koreans, right? So, but at some point, not long ago, all these prices were on its peak. And then you ended up having a lot of interest, and people saw a lot of opportunity on then mobilizing capital for implementation of carbon projects. And I don't know who came with this misinformation, but some people probably thought that carbon market was quick and easy. And there is nothing more distant from truth, because you do have these markets, and all these markets, they have different carbon instruments. So you may have your carbon tax, you may have your carbon allowance that is linked to an ETS, right? And you can have what is called flexible mechanisms, either for your ETS or for your carbon tax. And those flexible mechanisms, that's what we call the carbon offsets. While all these markets, they are usually focused on a certain geography or a certain sectoral coverage, not all the geographies are part of that, not all the sectors within the geography, right? So if we go to Europe, there are 5 sectors: pulp and paper, steel mills, cement, petrochemical, and power. What about aluminium? Aluminium is out of the EU ETS. What about food industry? Out of EU ETS. So you do have a lot of industries that are out of the ETS. So again, the coverage can be geographic, can be sectoral. But then how can I have a carbon pricing that can influence capital allocation and can influence decarbonization across sectors or across geographies that are not covered by my carbon compliance scheme? That is a carbon offset. Okay, so the analogy is I will then, rather than reduce my emissions internally, I will support someone else to reduce on my behalf. And I will do that because across the world, you have so many opportunities for decarbonization. So many of them are considerably cheaper than me reducing internally, that it will be more effective and efficient economically if I support them to reduce now, and I allocate my capital towards their activities, then I reduce my own emissions. So then the carbon offset concept was created. And usually the carbon offset will be an emission reduction that is out of a geographical coverage of a carbon pricing scheme or out of a sectoral coverage of a carbon pricing scheme. And that became, with the Kyoto Protocol that defined it, okay, we do have the developed countries and the developing countries. So that was the way of developed countries supporting developing countries to reduce their emissions and promote the sustainable development, right? So the Kyoto credits were nothing but acquisition of those credits as one of the ways to do this capital allocation towards cheaper emission reductions. And for example, a typical example of the Kyoto Protocol, if we think about waste management, on the early 2000s, all Europe already had a pretty good waste management practice. All the waste would be going either for incineration or landfills. All the landfill gas was already collected and used for power generation, for heat generation, etc. And you would go to Latin America or Africa, there was a dump site. So they still had to be able to transform that dump site into a landfill. If it was a landfill, a properly managed landfill, collect the gas, destroy the gas, because on the baseline scenario, without any investment, you had all that gas being vented. And that would cost you anything between $2 and $5 per ton for you to have that massive upgrade on infrastructure in developing countries. Here in Europe, probably for us to improve the waste management system would cost dozens, if not hundreds of dollars.
And can I interrupt? Because this is something that really interests me, because there's always this argument when it comes to offsets that, it's not fair to outsource your action. But what you're really talking about is greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere. It's a global problem with global implications that play out in very local ways. But what you're doing by using an offset in that way is you're allowing for fundamental rapid transformation of the industrial nature of a country that's not there yet, instead of incremental change, which is the hardest part for an industry or for a company to do. Once you've done the basics, it gets more difficult and more expensive to improve.
Exactly. So you do have this concept of abatement cost, marginal abatement cost. So usually you're going to start with the low-hanging fruit. The next one will be more expensive than the previous one, and so on. The more you abate it on your emission reductions, more expensive it is than to reduce it. And because it's a global problem, look, Europe can go to net zero tomorrow. If the rest of the world keeps emitting, the climate change will happen anyway. So you do need this international cooperation, and you do need this global effort on reducing your emissions. And you do have this concept that has been, since the very beginning of the climate negotiations, shared but differentiated responsibilities. You do have countries that has been emitting more. So everyone has a shared responsibility, a common responsibility towards the climate change, but it's differentiated. You do have countries who emitted more historically than others. So these countries who emitted more, they, coincidence or not, they are usually the most advanced countries, the richest countries in the world. So they have a responsibility on supporting the others to leapfrog and not go through the same pathway that they did. Like, not everyone needs to go through the English Industrial Revolution and start consuming coal like crazy before they change from coal to gas, and from gas to renewable power, right? So renewable energy today is readily available. In some countries, it may not be that easy to be implemented. So carbon could be one of the supporters or enablers of that kind of investment, and helping African countries which has no energy access leapfrog from no energy access to renewable energy access. So that is the ultimate goal and what is behind the carbon offsets. So it's this cooperation and this cross-geographical and cross-sectoral investment and financing.
I think this is one of those areas where that needs to be, I think, more explicit in a lot of our conversations, because when we look at the pricing of carbon in different jurisdictions, you mentioned there's a huge range of pricing because it's about the cost of abatement. But I remember, I think it was last year, it could have been earlier this year, the US EPA came out with a report on the social cost of carbon, and they put it as $190. Well, if you can spend that equivalent of $190 somewhere where it will have much more impact, really what we're saying is that offsets are about getting the most bang for your buck.
Exactly. So again, you can say, if it's $190, the cost of emission reduction in the US, you get the same amount of money today, and you can probably reduce anything between 10 and 15 tons if that capital is allocated in a reforestation project in Africa, or on a better waste management practice in Latin America, or whatever. But I think the problem that we have today is that, well, two problems. So we have the problem of demand and the problem of supply. The problem of demand is we have 80 schemes with 80 different approaches and requests related to offsets. Some cases accept offsets only within the country. So you would be developing offsets on sectors that are not covered by the EU ETS or by carbon tax. Some few cases do accept international offsets, but with a lot of restrictions. So you end up also with 80 different pricing signals for the offsets as well. The only single international market for offsets is actually the voluntary market, because then a company anywhere in the world can buy and pay with no restrictions, or the restrictions self-imposed, right? This demand is a weak demand. We already proven weak, can go up and down depending on the economic cycle and economic and market mood. But not only that, you also had problems on the supply side. So recently, conservation projects, they became I'm going to use the conservation projects as an illustration. Okay, we all know it's more expensive to plant than to preserve. So And we all know that across the developing countries, especially the tropical countries, you do have a massive deforestation going on due to pressure of conversion of forests into agricultural land, due to the growth of population, due to land speculation, a series of drivers that you have that has been causing massive deforestation on tropical countries. But this tropical forest deforestation is expensive to the society. You just gave the price of 190 as an example, right? But usually those low-tech agriculture, they will cost you, well, they will generate a profit below $50 per hectare per year. It's low profitability. So what about if you go to a country or to a landowner and say, look, don't deforest. I can pay you $20 per year, $50 per year for you to preserve the land. And that will generate you a carbon cost of $5 or $10. So again, it's a quite low cost of abatement on average compared to other options. But then I think it was mistranslated on the process. Someone said, well, then I get money for doing nothing. So carbon will be easy, will be quick, and I can jump into this sector and I can grab land on whatever way and be able to have this very low cost abatement process. The demand is going to the roof, prices is going to the roof. I'm going to be super rich by doing nothing. And again, as I said, there's nothing more wrong than saying that carbon is quick and easy, right? A carbon offset is a long process, very detailed, not perfect. But if you tell me anything else that you do go through 2 or 3 different auditing processes by different counterparties and etc., I would be curious to learn more. What is this product that you're talking about? But on carbon, you do. So you have to do some massive studies, go through some of these external auditing process and all that for you to generate carbon credit. Usually, that journey will take anything on a well-developed project will take anything between 3 to 5 years between you starting to conceptualize your project, designing, doing a proper consultation with local stakeholders, doing a free and prior informed consent with the local communities, developing all the necessary studies to demonstrate what would be the baseline without your project intervention, then demonstrate the functionality, and that is an important concept that we can touch soon. Go through a second external auditing process, just to confirm that you have the right to claim carbon credits. So when you have your project registered, just says you have the right to claim carbon offsets. Right after that, you still need to monitor your project, go through all the data collection process to demonstrate what was your emission reduction de facto, how good was your monitoring process. You go through a second auditing process, eventually a third one, and then you have the carbon credits issued. But again, not long ago, you had a lot of capital mobilization in the world because of the COVID, because of the quantitative easing prior to COVID. And then suddenly you had a lot of capital allocation to the carbon market because everyone thought that it was the next gold rush. And you had a lot of newcomers, cowboys, a lot of them thinking that, if I do nothing, I will get a lot of money. It will be quick. It will be easy. We can tokenize it. We can create the whatever carbon coins, etc. And then you had a lot of people that rather than playing by the rules, they said, oh no, that is too long. That is too difficult. Let me try to find out some shortcuts and cut some corners here and there. And you ended up having a lot of very bad projects, a lot of fraudulent projects who were just trying to milk the market, and these great expectations that there were about you having something that has a very low cost of abatement and potentially a very high price. So again, that situation is not the first time that it happens in our society, will not be the last. I think on this case, what was quite cruel from whoever participated with those intentions was that we were dealing with the future of the planet, right? So we were dealing with the well-being of a lot of people and with the decarbonization of our economy. And then that this amount of problematic projects, and it's one more hit on the trust of the society into the carbon market as a mechanism. So you did have, we are coming back to trust again. So we did have this hit on trust in 2009 on the international negotiations. Today, what we are seeing is a hit on trust because you do have a lot of fraudulent players in the market. But what's happening is that very volatile demand that I mentioned on the voluntary market fled away. It's not there anymore because corporations reasonably, they say, if I'm going to be criticized, if I'm going to spend money and be criticized, I prefer to be criticized for free, right? With no expenditures. So let me understand what are the rules of the game, and then I'm going to be back when the rules of the game are clear, when I know that the market participants are serious people, when I know that the regulations and the guidance on how I should report and pledge my emission reductions are clear and all that. So we have seen a lot of let me wait and see, and then I will come back to the market again soon. But going back, carbon offsets are that opportunity for you to develop a project anywhere in the world, any sector, that will help the sustainable development of communities and of the society as a whole for much cheaper abatement costs than if you do at your own, right? It's just that. And I think it's a fundamental instrument of the carbon market itself, because that is what will bring back this participative approach, this sense of everyone being part of it.
So how do things have to change in order to bring that participative approach back? You know, are we talking about things like monitoring and verification? Are we talking about new methodologies? Or are we talking about, you know, Azerbaijan and the need for the Paris Agreement and COP29 to reach agreement on the international frameworks? You know, what do you think are going to be the key steps towards a wider reacceptance and use of the carbon markets as a means of funneling money to action on climate change?
We're talking about all and everything, to be frank. So, look, you started asking about MRV, right? So when we talk about monitoring of carbon emissions and monitoring of emission reductions, there are two things. So one is, depending on the type of activity that you have, monitoring of it can be really expensive, right? So you may end up having to make some concessions in order to achieve a reasonable price of such monitoring, because you do want to have your money going to the climate action and not to the monitoring of the climate action. So how then I can do something monitoring that becomes reasonably cheap and effective and precise, right? And we did have during this past 5 or 10 years, but I would say more within the last 5 years, great technological leaps that enable us to upgrade and improve our monitoring process of carbon projects, right? So 5 years ago, you could not do the same level of satellite image analysis that you can do today. It didn't exist, right? Internet of Things, it didn't exist. So, and I'm just giving those examples because when you think about conservation projects or reforestation projects, yeah, today you can monitor from anywhere in the world. You take those high resolution satellite images, you can process it in a matter of seconds, and voila, you do have some outcome if your forest exists, doesn't exist, if your forest is growing, not growing, etc. It is there. Internet of Things. So you have those cook stove projects. Today, for a couple of dollars, you can put little pieces of electronics on a cook stove, and you can know if the cook stove is on and off, for how many hours is on, if it has been operating at the optimal temperature or not. Like, you can measure a lot of things. Usually those measurements are not what define a good or bad project. Usually the good or bad project is on the design of things, and the design cannot be replaced by technology. On the design of things, you do require experience, goodwill, and trying to do the right thing, right? You can measure eventually the amount of biomass on a forest by the gram, but you will not know if there was a prior consent of the local population on if you are having a fair share of those benefits of the carbon market with the local society and with the local communities. So I think that the MRV and the technology is something that I've seen and heard a lot, but I usually tell people, look, carbon projects, they always have human interaction involved, human contracts. It's always about the people. So yeah, you can help me on having a better monitoring of my project, but you cannot necessarily solve all my problems. And by the way, my real pain is on the design and engagement with my stakeholders, being my local authorities, being the local population, being the academic community that may help me on doing a bunch of analysis, being on my buyer, understanding that what they are buying is real, is additional, it's conservative, it's all that. So again, a lot of those elements are related to this human interaction. And that is one of the things that, yeah, technology cannot solve it. And you still need the experience, and you still need the human engagement and the openness and willingness to do things on the right way. And then just talking about what's going on the market. So market has crashed, prices went down, right? And I think that is great. That is great because all those people who were here for the quick buck, who were here just to take advantage of a very short-term market opportunity, they are gone. I don't know if with cash or with no cash, with profits or not profits, but they are literally all of them. We can see a lot of people exiting the market, right? On the very short term, it will create a very hard condition for the market. So like very fluid demand, a lot of regulatory process being developed to bring such clarity on the regulatory side or on the voluntary side. But we are moving towards the right direction. So you can see the companies, for example, a lot of companies, I could see them having a small but a very big change. So all this climate agenda and the climate budget moving from the sustainability department to finance department. What does it mean? Rather than living through budget cycles, so every year you allocate a budget, doesn't matter what the market price is, that is the budget. You have limited ability on how to handle your budget or what to do with your budget. Little ability you have, but little flexibility on how to deal with that budget. It moves to finance, to treasury, and the carbon becomes the equivalent to license to operate. And if the prices go up, then yeah, your costs go up and you need to deal with that. And you will start to think about ahead and hedge your carbon prices and etc. And embed that on all your financial decision makings within the company, right? So those are small changes that most likely in a lot of situations people don't see, but that change represents a massive improvement on the way that the market will, on how what the market will be in the very short future, because we're going to have better market participants, more committed, a more solid demand, a capital readier to be deployed. And again, the opportunities are still there. You do have a lot of areas in the world that does require a lot of investment on green infrastructure, on better ways of living, and it doesn't cost much from the perspective of carbon for that to be achieved, right? Especially if you do compare with those CDRs, for example.
I think that is a perfect and very positive note to end this part of our conversation. I think we've got a lot more to talk about. But for today, Pablo, thank you so much for joining us. I think, it's clear to see that the carbon markets are in a state of flux at the moment, but they're on their way to becoming a really fundamental mechanism in the way in which we address climate change. And for those companies thinking about getting involved in the offsets market, perhaps it is a call to arms to think about what the carbon markets mean to you. What do you want to use them for? How do you want to get involved? And, if you have questions for Pablo or for EcoSecurities, I will make sure I put all his details in the show notes. And on that note, I will just say to our listeners, thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again.